Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the America First Policy Institute. We want to thank you for joining us at AFPI's latest installment of our speaker series. My name is Doug Holscher, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at AFPI. Today's topic, Unleashing U.S. Energy Dominance, is perhaps the most relevant it has been since the OPEC oil crises of the 1970s. Before we begin today's program, where you'll hear from Senator Barrasso, as well as AFPI's David Bernhardt and Fred Fleitz, I want to share a little bit about the AFPI team, which aims every day to advance policies that put the American people and American interests first. We have 21 policy centers that work to implement the America First agenda on nearly every front, from education to defense to healthcare to immigration and, of course, energy, just to name a few. America is a nation of energy abundance, not just in terms of the molecules in the ground, but also the abundance of energy innovation. From the shale revolution unleashed by the great George P. Mitchell to the pioneers developing the next generation of energy technology, the U.S. has created levels of economic opportunity and security for the American family, and in doing so, has become an energy superpower. Still, we are facing significant challenges today as energy prices reach record levels, forcing American families, workers, farmers, small businesses, and other companies to make difficult choices. Energy prices had risen significantly before the barbaric war in Ukraine, but the war has put further pressure on prices and heightened Americans' awareness of the importance of energy independence. But America is not alone in facing these challenges. But, if allowed, America does have unique solutions to those challenges. We are honored to be joined by one of our nation's greatest advocates of the America First movement and a stalwart defender of American energy independence, Senator John Barrasso. Senator Barrasso hails from Wyoming, an energy-producing state, and he serves as the ranking member on the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and also serves as the Finance Committee and Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Barrasso, more than most, understands the potential of American innovative and entrepreneurial spirit, and he understands the threats facing our domestic industry, whether that comes in the form of regulatory overreach from the federal government or state governments, bad policies, or the predatory market behaviors of our adversaries like China. We could not have a more fitting speaker to set the scene for today's discussion. With that, it's my honor to introduce a very special guest, Senator John Barrasso.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I have a wonderful staff, and they've written a magnificent 20-page speech, and I left it on my desk at the office. When I think of energy, I think about energy security for our nation, economic strength, and environmental stewardship, and nobody does it better than us. Energy is used as a weapon. Energy is a source of power. It's the ultimate source of power, truly. And Donald Trump, President Trump, America First, was absolutely right. We are much better if we are selling energy to our friends than if we are having to buy it from our enemies. That's what it means. That's what we focus on, and that's what I focus on. I was in the state legislature, in the Wyoming State Senate, where I was on the Minerals Committee, which dealt a lot with energy, and continue to represent Wyoming, and very proud to do it. And we know that we do it better than people around the world. We shouldn't be going to Iran, shouldn't be going to Venezuela. We have the resources here. We have an administration who will not let us get it out of the ground. President Trump took us to energy dominance, and Joe Biden has now taken us to energy dependence. So as I was looking at my 20-page speech, I said, you know, there's something much better than that. And if you turn to USA Today this morning, Biden's policies have led to higher gas prices. David Bernhardt, former Interior Secretary. The newspaper of choice, USA Today. This says it all. Biden has chosen climate activism over a rise in oil production. That's the story. He has. He's had to make a choice. Right now, Europe is wide awake, and Joe Biden is still sleepwalking. In Europe, they realize what a monumental mistake it was on their part to become so dependent on their enemies for their energy. But Joe Biden's still marching to the tune of the climate elitists in his administration. He ran for office that way, he got elected that way, and he continues to govern that way. Day number one, went to the White House, pulled out the trigger, pulled out the gun, drew a target on the back of American Energy and pulled the trigger. Killed Keystone XL pipeline, stopped oil and gas exploration in the United States in terms of permits, and that's the way he's ruled the entire time he's been there. And then he's surrounded himself with this group and his nominees, and I mean, David, I mean, the change between you and the current Secretary of Interior, who said we're just going to keep it all in the ground, and then my friend from Idaho who is here, who deals as we do in Wyoming with the grizzly bear, she said the grizzly bear should have a seat at the table. You think about that one from the standpoint of the Endangered Species Act. You know, has a very different view this administration does on the role of the government and the role of the private sector. You know, I'm a guy that believes that our job as Republicans is to grow the economy, and the Democrats' job seemed to be to grow the government. And talking to one of the folks here today who was involved in the transition through the EPA, the previous administration, look at the EPA now, the president's budget. What does he want to do with this budget now? With over 1,000 more EPA employees, including a whole bunch of paid interns so they can get ready to have future EPA workers. Train them young to then go in and get involved in the administrative levels to deny America the ability to produce clean energy in ways that we know how to do it. We all want to make energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can. We want to do it in ways that don't raise costs for American consumers. And that was the other piece of paper I brought today, which was from another great newspaper known as Roll Call. And of course, I'm going to put a picture of David, I'm going to put a picture of myself. This is today, and it has our Republican leadership at our stakeout after our policy lunch, and I'm holding a drawing of a gas pump with prices on it. $2.38 the day that Joe Biden came into office, add $1.15, which is the Biden increase prior to Putin's invasion into Ukraine, and then $4.32 average price today as a result of Biden plus Putin. The number one issue in the American voters' mind and American families' minds today is inflation. People are feeling the pain. You want to fill your tank, you got to empty your wallet. And that's because they will not allow us to get it out of the ground. That is the mantra of this administration. They would rather worship at the altar of the climate elites who want to do things dramatically, unilaterally, and immediately, regardless of the impact that it's going to have, how detrimental it's going to be to the economy, and the fact it's not actually going to help the environment. Emissions in the United States have been going down over the last 12, 13, 14 years because nobody does it better than we do. And yet we have an administration that doesn't seem to believe it. They don't do math. They sing love songs. And that's not a way to power our country or power the planet. It's not realistic. I'm a guy that believes we can protect the environment without punishing the economy. They just don't believe it. And that's the fight that we're in. And they want to keep it in the ground, and the president has said that. Now, yesterday at our policy lunch, I played a video of 15 different senators talking about energy costs and the impact on families. But we started it with you'll love this, with a video that we found of Chuck Schumer from 2018. And he's at a gas station. And he's saying to President Trump, gasoline is $2.80 a gallon. What are you going to do about it, President Trump? Oh, do I miss those days. As do the American public. And I think the voters are going to make a decision come November to say that this is an administration that has mismanaged everything. They mismanaged energy, clearly. They've mismanaged what's happening in international affairs. We've seen it in Afghanistan with the despicable and deadly withdrawal, disgraceful as it was from Afghanistan. And the president has never recovered, and that's why people don't really believe that he's up to speed in terms of dealing with what he ought to do with Ukraine and Russia. Sanctions beforehand, I think, would have stopped if we'd have gotten putting the axe to not the Keystone Pipeline, but to Nord Stream 2 pipeline, that would have made a big difference. I think that would have been enough to not have, because what Russia uses energy as a weapon. And even though we've stopped imports of Russian oil to the United States, and remember in Biden's first year, in the first 14 months in office, we brought a lot more crude oil to the United States from Russia than we had previously. To the point when Lisa Murkowski goes on the floor of the Senate and in the Senate Energy Committee talks about the fact that, right, we were using more Russian oil than Alaskan oil. Because, of course, Biden shut down Alaskan exploration and oil. I mean, this is the mindset of a John Kerry who's worried more about the climate implications of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And he's actually said that. He didn't want that to distract from the climate agenda. And he actually said at the energy conference in Houston, I don't know if you were there, David, for that, but he said that that what we're seeing happening there in terms of the, 4 million people who've now left Ukraine to avoid a mass murder, so like nothing compared to what you're going to see with climate refugees. This is the mindset of the administration, and the president is really, as I said, sleepwalking through all of it. So that's the fight that we have. Now, I believe we're going to take the House and take the Senate. I'm doing everything I can, and I know you are as well, to help us in that effort, to take those. So then I'm the chairman of the Energy Committee, and Shelley Moore Capito is head of the EPW Committee. They're going to try to do more things with regulations. Even if we stop the House and stop the Senate, Joe Biden's still going to be in the White House, but we're going to have to tie his hands in ways that he can't continue to do the damage that he's doing to our economy in ways that aren't helping the environment in the long run and helping us as a nation. So I have lots and lots we can talk about. The wonderful 20-page speech went to the fact that after the day after the State of the Union, I'd sent the President, as did the entire members of the Energy Committee, a list of 10 things he ought to be doing if he really did want to focus on American energy, making energy more affordable, make it easier when people go to the gas tank. And we can just get you the list and go through them, but you're going to agree with all of them. And it's about more American energy, energy workers. As I said yesterday at our stakeout afterwards, I said, look, if the President really cares to do what he's promised to do, and you heard him in Poland last week about what we want to do to help Europe, all the natural gas that we're going to ship, he actually has to do a couple of things, because the White House said they don't know how they're going to do it. Where's it going to come from? That's what they said. They didn't know what the promise. A lot of empty promises by a president who's known for making empty promises. He had to reverse himself, 4 times, or they had to walk back comments he's made 4 times on the trip. But the one with energy, you know, he said, we're going to help with all this. Well, if he really wants to help, if he is really focused on lowering the costs and the prices, there's some things he can do. And it's not to follow the frightened 4 Democrats who say, well, we'll just eliminate the federal gas tax. We'll give them a federal gas tax holiday, 18 cents. That's still, you're still over $4 a gallon. Oh, and they're going to put it on right after Election Day. You can tell how scared they are and how the fact that they know that they're in a position where they're all going to lose. Because people are not happy. They're feeling the pain. You know how unrealistic it is. And then they have another idea. You have those members of the House who are afraid they're going to lose their seats. So they say, well, we're just going to send out checks. Anytime, I know it's hard to believe, but that's what they came out with. Anytime gas is more than $4 a gallon in a month, everybody's going to get a $100 check to help fill their tank. Well, what's that going to do in terms of the law of supply and demand? Why do we have a lot of this inflation now? Part of it is bad energy policies by the administration. Part of the fact is they're just sending out all this money. So you have more money, supply, demand. That's how we saw inflation. Larry Summers saw inflation. The Democrats said, oh, transitory, 8 months in a row. It's here to stay. And for those of you who had a chance to look through the budget, what did the President say? Their assessed value of what they think inflation is going to be next year, 2.3%. How out of touch can you be? Well, those are they don't put the gas in Air Force One or in the helicopter or the presidential limousine. Out of touch, for sure. And many of you worked in the House, worked in the Senate, as Lamar Alexander used to say, the Senate is the finest assisted living facility in the world. And Joe Biden got to the Senate at age 29, and he's now, I think, 79. And for 50 years, he's been surrounded by people saying he was the best and the brightest and knew everything and could never make a mistake. You know, I think Bob Gates was right that in fact he's never actually been on the right side of any of the foreign policy decisions in history. But that's what we're dealing with in the White House, that think they have all the answers, but really are out of touch with what certainly the men and women in Wyoming tell me every weekend. I'll be in Wyoming tomorrow night. I was in Wyoming on Monday. Talk to folks, travel the state, visit with people. I know what's happening at home. And our Republican senators do as well. And people running for office know it as well. And the Democrats that do go home know it, and they are afraid of what's going to happen with them, because we should be an energy-dominant nation. We have the resources here. So what I said yesterday at our stakeout was, if the president is really interested, because he made all these empty promises, you know, and he's going to deliver this and deliver that, but they don't know how they're going to do it. And Vince, you know this from your days in Wyoming and growing up there. In Wyoming, when people make all these statements but don't have anything to show for it, they call it all hat and no cattle. And that's what Joe Biden is on this, and his administration is. But if he's real serious about getting back to America first and focusing on what the needs of America, he has to do three things. One is he has to actually say, we're going to produce more oil and gas in America. We're going to call off the attack dogs in all of these different places where they're on the move, whether it's the EPA. He wants to put Federal Reserve people in to use the Federal Reserve to go after oil and gas. Call off all the attack dogs and let us actually get the energy out of the ground, because we have it. We have it in abundance. And the second thing he has to do is he has to say, and we're going to actually build the pipelines and allow for permits for the pipelines, cut the red tape, and improve the permitting for the export terminals to move LNG to Europe. There have been 6 permits sitting for over a year. They finally approved 2 weeks ago, which was 2 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. So slow to act, got more to do. That's the second. And the third thing, he has to stop vilifying the hardworking oil and gas people of this country who go to work every day to make sure we can keep the lights on and we can drive our cars. That's it. That's what he needs to do. It's not going to solve things immediately, but it'll send a message to the markets that energy's on the way, prices will come down. And we have a lot of people in Wyoming and around the country who are ready to answer that call. But this is a guy that has Iran and Venezuela on speed dial, but the calls are blocked coming in from Wyoming and Texas and other places that want to produce the energy. So that's the fight we're in, and I'm glad you're all joining on our side of the fight, because we have the greatest country of all times. It is. We have the resources. We are an energy powerhouse, and we ought to act like it. Thanks so much for letting me join you today.
Strong leader for American energy independence, and we look forward to having you back often. Thank you. All right, I'd like to invite David Bernhardt and Fred Fleitz to come up and join me on the stage, and we'll have a discussion, and we look forward to some interaction with the audience as well. But I think the Senator set the stage really well for the next part of the program, and we heard some solutions there at the end of his remarks, and also a really keen focus on the problem at hand. And so I appreciate Fred and David joining. David, you as the former Secretary of the Department of Interior, probably as that Secretary did more on energy than actually the Secretary of Energy, as some could argue, but obviously we had 2 great secretaries, and yourself and Secretary Perry and others who came along in the fight as well. I want to start, David, with yourself on the Biden administration sometimes talks about Putin's price hike and the impact of high prices on American families. Do you agree that it's really Putin's price hike that we're dealing with, and is that what is really causing the pain for American families and farmers and workers?
Well, you know, I think the Senator just illustrated that fact far better and more eloquently than I did. I would be able to by laying out just precisely how prices had gone up and were continuing to go up well before the situation occurred in Ukraine. That said, we have to recognize that this president fairly campaigned on a pledge to be hostile to the oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. He campaigned on that. He, as the Senator said, brought people into his organization to be part of his administration that believed in that and had that as their philosophical agenda. From day one, he's been hostile to the energy industry across the board in his rhetoric and in his actions. Keystone was just the beginning of a concerted and conscious effort to do exactly what the senator described, which is an effort to keep it in the ground and keep costs higher, increase costs. There's a value to them for increasing costs, and that is it helps justify some of their more radical ideas. And so the reality is now their rhetoric is beginning to shift, but their efforts have been consistent and deliberate and conscious, and it's my assertion that they will continue to be to the extent that they believe that they can get away with it politically.
Maybe a quick follow-up for you, Secretary, and then we'll go to Fred. You've also heard some voices in Congress and elsewhere calling for suspension of the gas tax, calling for distribution of gas rebates, which sound kind of like a Band-Aid, well-intended, but a Band-Aid to the bigger problem. What do you think of those proposals, and how would you recommend we best address the pain for hardworking Americans?
Well, let's recognize that people are hurting dramatically. A few days ago, I got in an Uber to go from here up to Capitol Hill. And as I was driving up there, a young lady who was driving the Uber explained to me that she drove during the day, her husband drove during the night, and they were not allowing, being able to have their living requirements fulfilled. The cost of gasoline had become so exorbitant to them that it was causing them challenges, plus the challenges in the increased food. And as we approached the Capitol, she said to me, "Do you visit with the people that work here?" And I said, "Not very often, as little as possible, to be honest with you." And she said, but I said sometimes. And she said, "Would you tell them that we're hurting? That we're hurting?" And I think that the reaction there, the reality is that people are hurting. There are ways to deal with this, and the easiest way, in my opinion, is to take the knob that says do not process permits and turn it from off to let's process permits. And let me give you an example. In January of 2020, in December of 2020, the Bureau of Land Management processed over about 865 permits for permits to drill on federal lands. In December of 2021, the Bureau of Land Management under Biden processed 164 permits on public land, while 4,600 were pending. So what that means is that they consciously made a decision to slow things down by 80%. In January of 2022, that same office processed 95 permits. That is a conscious and deliberate decision to slow things down.
Yeah, and a lot of folks are feeling that pain. I think where I'm from in rural Iowa, folks are getting ready for planting season, and diesel fuel costs are hurting folks that drive truck across the country. They're feeling that as well, and so thanks for your perspective on that. Fred was the chief of staff in the National Security Council and the Trump administration at the White House, and really looking forward to having your input on some of the national security implications of this conversation. And part of that is the geopolitical instability, and really a reminder to all of us that we heard from the senator that energy security is national security, Fred. And I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about Putin's invasion and the dynamics around that, and the added exposure of vulnerability that invasion has put on our national security and our energy security. And could you just discuss the strategic implications of that and some perspective on that?
Will do, and it's great to be on this panel. Secretary Bernhardt, thanks all for coming. We know that energy security is good for our country. It puts money in the pockets of Americans. It lowers costs, creates jobs, promotes industry. But it also affects the global oil market. It lowers prices when our country is a net oil exporter. And when we're in this situation, friendly and unfriendly nations do not have that energy leverage that they can use against our country. Iran and China and, well, not China, Iran and Venezuela and Russia have leverage when they have a significant amount of oil exports to the U.S. and to our allies. And the situation under the Trump administration, when we were a net exporter of oil, that leverage wasn't there. Now, that's changed now. We're now importing oil from almost 70 countries. 8% of our oil is coming from Russia. We can compensate for that, but European states are in a different position. They're importing about 20% of their oil from Russia and a larger percent of natural gas from most European nations. This gives Putin leverage that he can use over our country. Well, the leverage can be overcome if we were to increase domestic oil production again, if we were to produce oil production, gas production, and if we encourage our European allies to do the same. But we're not doing that because of the green dream, the so-called Green New Deal. We are trying to move away from fossil fuels. This is a war on fossil fuels. It's a war on gasoline-powered engines. And by going this route, and as Secretary Bernhardt said, this is a choice. This spike in oil prices and gas prices is a choice because of this effort to go down a route that is deliberately hurting our economy. And we know what happens when we talk to those on the left who want high gas prices. They say, well, go take the bus. Buy an electric-powered car. All this is doing is giving leverage to our enemies. And we're seeing this with this invasion of Ukraine because Russia's invasion has further driven up oil prices. And we have to understand that the invasion of Ukraine was paid for by the increased energy prices caused by the Biden administration when it decided to drastically reduce domestic energy production. So all of this is related. The solution is domestic energy production, and it isn't just a problem in this country. We're seeing the same thing in Europe. The Germans don't plan on increasing domestic energy. They don't plan on turning their nuclear power plants back on. They plan to continue the green dream. They're not planning on finding a solution to this. And a lot of people say, well, let's just send LNG ships, liquefied natural gas ships, to Germany. That will replace the Russian gas. Someday, there's an enormous investment in infrastructure for those ships and for the terminals to take this gas in, and that isn't going to be done anytime soon. There's no easy way to replace Russian gas exports to Germany, no matter what you hear in the news media. So it is an enormous challenge we have, and under this administration, I don't see any answers.
Thanks, Fred. And I want to continue on something we heard from Senator Barrasso and go to you, David. And you talked a little bit about the need to increase domestic energy production. The Biden administration has said that oil and gas companies have everything they need. You talked a little bit about the leases earlier, but the Biden administration has cited that there's 9,000 unused leases that are out there. And again, they've said that oil and gas companies have everything they need. Do you think that's true? And I guess could you drill down a little bit on that? And what other solutions besides getting the bureaucracy out of the way would you recommend?
So I think they did allude to 9,000 leases and then recognized that that was a misspoke point and said it was permits. So let me take the issues one at a time. For leases, the Department of the Interior has about 38,000 leases on public lands for oil and gas activity. And of those, about 66% actually are producing energy. Now, if you look at it historically, what you would find is we actually lease far less land today than we did in the past, and yet production has gone way up. And the reason that is because technology has improved so much that production has moved forward. But there are several thousand leases that are tied up in litigation. And what that means is somebody bid and paid for a lease, but because it's in litigation, they can't proceed forward on acting on that lease. And their money has been distributed to the federal government and to the states under the Mineral Leasing Act. And as a result of that, those leases are in abeyance. So that's one reason you may have leases that are not producing. You sometimes have bids for leases where their exploration is done, and the answer is there's no energy there. That's the risk that a bidder of a lease takes in exploring an area once they've leased it. And you also have other regulatory requirements that are needed. NEPA has to be done for exploration, rights of way have to be granted. So getting the lease isn't the end of the discussion, despite that statement. With permits, once you have a permit, you may or may not proceed forward immediately, depending on what environmental requirements there are. There are timing stipulations of when you can take particular activities. There's limitations related to the timing of big game seasons. And so there's a host of reasons why a particular permit may not be drilled on in the moment that it's granted. In addition, companies often try and have their plans programmed in a way that they utilize drilling for a whole host of permits at one time, and so that requires a development schedule. So there's a variety of reasons why a permit won't maybe be used immediately, but here's the reality. What we do know is 4,600 permits have been requested by companies to the government today. They paid between $10,000 and $15,000 for each of those permits, and those permits have not yet been processed. So that tells me that at a minimum, the energy industry believes that there's at least that much interest in moving forward in projects that they need in particular. In terms of leasing, this is the first administration that's ever gone this long without a lease sale. I think by now, the Obama administration would have held about 55 lease sales. So this is completely unprecedented. And what that means long-term is that we're not engaging in exploration activities that would lead to oil and gas development in the future. Now that's something that maybe is a policy desire for some, but what it does mean is that the federal government will not receive royalties from that money going forward at the time that they might have otherwise. But more importantly, the American public won't have the benefit of that development opportunity. And you need to remember that federal development's only about a third, it's about 25%, truthfully, of development for energy on our lands. And so the pipeline issues, which they've been rigorous in slowing down and thinking about new policies. The constraints on pipelines and transporting of these products is extraordinary, and they are going to be exacerbated over time. So those are the facts of where we are from a policy perspective right now.
So that's, I think, a great overview of the challenges they're facing now, but also the point you make of those challenges could get heightened in the future based on the decisions the current administration is making right now.
Sure, the fact that you have no exploration taking place on new leased lands means that exploration will have to take place either at a later time or perhaps never. And you have to recognize that this is all in a climate or an environment where at the same time the regulators are slowing down deliberately and consciously. They're also conveying to the financial sector, look, this is not a good place to be. And they have been openly hostile on a concerted basis to these development activities. And where I'm from in Western Colorado, these development activities are very important to our local economy. They are important to the American economy overall. If you go back and look at job growth in 2020 or 2000 to today, what you say is that the energy innovation moment played a huge role in our increased economic opportunity. And so we're moving backwards.
Thanks, David. I want to go to Fred and talk a little bit about the ban on Russian oil imports and the authorization of releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Could you discuss the effectiveness of those strategies as you've seen it, and add some perspective on how it's deterred or not deterred Russia?
Well, the deterrence question is an interesting one, and it became a big issue in the press recently when President Biden said that the sanctions that were being discussed before the invasion were not intended to deter an invasion, even though we know multiple administration officials said it was intended to deter an invasion. But could it have deterred Russia, and why didn't it deter? First of all, these sanctions, and contrary to what many in Congress were calling for, were not imposed until after Russia invaded. So that was one thing. So one could argue that they didn't stop something that hadn't taken place yet. But the threat of sanctions is an ultimatum. It is a warning to another state not to do something. And the Obama and Biden administrations have not had much credibility in terms of ultimatums and drawing red lines. It was a big issue during the Obama years, and I think it has continued into this administration because we've seen a year of policy failures with Afghanistan, an emphasis on climate change as the major national security objective. So when Biden administration officials laid down their ultimatum of sanctions against Russia, I think that Putin just was inclined to ignore what was being warned. I think trying to sanction Russia out of something that Putin wants to do also is very difficult. So recently there was a decision that the U.S. would stop importing Russian oil. But it's worth noting that this was a decision that the administration was dragged kicking and screaming to make. The only reason that Biden decided to do that was because Congress was going to do it. Even Nancy Pelosi said that she was going to do it. So you might say, well, why was that? It's so obvious the U.S. should stop importing Russian oil. What was the reason that the White House didn't want to do that? And the reason was because they were worried it would drive gas prices up higher. And I'm afraid too many decisions for our national security in this administration are being driven by domestic politics. I believe that President Biden is scared to death of the effect that high gas prices will have on the elections this fall. And to the credit of Democrats in Congress, they realized, even though it may have some political damage, this is the right thing to do. So I think when we make decisions this way, it further undermines the credibility of our commander-in-chief, and it's going to make it harder when he puts warnings down in the future to get our adversaries to honor what he's calling for.
Thanks, Fred. David, wanted to drill down a little bit and extend that conversation on some states and territories are impacted more by the Russian market than others. For example, Hawaii, I think, gets about a quarter of its refining capacity from Russia. What avenues would you recommend to reduce the energy vulnerability for Hawaii and those other states? I think anybody who's traveled to Hawaii has probably seen the gas prices there were high even before the crisis, but I can only imagine they're much worse right now. What would be some of your thoughts there?
Well, short-term tough, right? Short-term tough. Long-term, the reality is for both oil and natural gas, as a country, we really need to think about having pipelines that flow to the West Coast. And a number of initiatives have been proposed in the past, and those have ultimately faltered, often because of the resistance of state officials. And so I think that that's something that as we look at where we need to be with pipelines, we really need to think about that. This is really more in Fred's wheelhouse, but I had the opportunity to serve both in the Bush administration and in the Trump administration. And I can assure you that President Trump's ability to work internationally on agreements with LNG fundamentally benefited our country in ways and in ways of national security that were choices that President Bush didn't have on the table in looking at Middle East policy and politics. And so having these energy resources available and able to be used internationally is a powerful tool for presidents in setting their foreign and national policy. And what we're seeing is an effort to go backwards, which is really remarkable for the country overall, and its benefit on the world stage, frankly.
Fred, we've heard the Secretary and Senator both talk about the need to increase domestic production. We've heard the Secretary talk a lot about the actions, the intended actions of the very conscious decisions to reduce that production both in the last year but in the future as well. You combine that with the market from Russia being cut off. You've got those two things happening all at once. And the administration has turned instead to countries like Venezuela and Iran for alternative paths to delivering energy. Could you talk about that dynamic and its implication on its impacts on the nation's broader national security?
Well, it's just stunning that this administration is so wedded to these radical green ideas that it's going hat in hand to Venezuela for oil. It's just stunning. Venezuela is closely allied with Russia, Iran, and China. The fact that we would simply decide to put our principles aside for domestic political reasons to get Venezuelan oil, it's just appalling. And I have no doubt that this terrible nuclear deal with Iran, which is worse than the Obama deal, which may be announced soon, has been accelerated to lower U.S. gas prices. I think that's absolutely certain. And I might add that this deal is so awful. To get it, we're going to have to take the Iranian Revolutionary Guard off of the State Department terrorism list. And we're going to say to them, we'll take you off the list if you promise not to attack us again. You think I'm kidding, I'm not. This is actually what this administration is planning. I'm very happy to see there's strong bipartisan opposition to this, and I'm hoping Senator Menendez will put his foot down and say, we cannot agree to this. But look, at the end of the day, the real solution here is domestic energy production and energy independence, and not just here, but in Europe also. There's a lot of energy that could be developed in Europe through shale and through fracking. And the Europeans just won't do it. They won't turn their reactors back on. That is making them dependent on Russia. That's giving Russia influence over their foreign policy. We have to move away from this radical green agenda, doing away with gasoline-powered automobiles, doing away with fossil fuels. It simply makes no sense. It's harming the American people. It's harming lower-income Americans. But this administration has no intention of doing that. But until we do, we're going to have serious implications, not just for our economy, but for global security.
Fred, I'm going to stay with you for one more question on China being a critical player in the Ukraine situation, but also in the energy dynamics around the world. Could you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how you see that playing out and some thoughts on how to handle that?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion of China's relationship with Russia. Clearly, China values this relationship to create a new world order that, especially a new economic order that is not dominated by the United States. And it is going to seize every opportunity in this Ukraine crisis to get cheap oil, to replace Western nations that have pulled out of Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine. And you can see that China is pushing Russian propaganda that the U.S. is somehow responsible for this invasion of Ukraine. However, I think there's some pretty convincing evidence that the Chinese are not at all happy about this invasion. I think they must have been told something by Putin. President Xi was probably told by Putin at the Olympics, this is going to be a maybe 3 to 5 day affair. We'll go in, decapitate the government, then we'll pull out. I think the Chinese are as appalled as the rest of the world at what's going on in Ukraine right now. And they are now promoting a policy called benevolent neutrality in which they're trying to support both sides and promote negotiations to stop this invasion. And I have to tell you, I believe the Chinese have a red line. I think if Putin did something really stupid, like use chemical weapons, the Chinese would bolt, and I think the Indians would too. But we should make no mistake, even though the Chinese may have some major qualms about the situation, they're going to exploit it. They're going to try to strike energy deals that will benefit it long after this situation is over. China is our major threat on the world stage. It is an existential threat to the United States and to global security. Russia's a threat, but Russia is a declining power with serious demographic problems, with an economy maybe the size of Italy. My colleague, General Cox, is the size of Belgium. I don't know which it is, but it is significantly weaker than the old Soviet Union. But it is a big factor here, and you can imagine China seeing opportunities to exploit the energy aspect of this crisis as much as it can.
I'm glad that you brought up the threat from China. Steve Yates is in the room, the chair of our China Policy Initiative, which we started up a little over a month ago, and really focusing on that existential threat from China, and we're taking a whole of society approach to how do we combat that and be sober about that threat. And so I appreciate your perspective on that. In fact, last night we had a premiere of the Hong Konger movie, and Senator Haggerty came and joined us for that discussion. And so that's a topic that we'll continue to pull the thread on and make sure we're helping lead the charge and holding China accountable and being sober about the threats we face there. I want to turn to the discussion of renewables a little bit, David. And continue on the China thread. There's a lot of dependencies on China in the renewable markets. Could you talk a little bit about those dependencies, and then we'll go to Fred to talk about the global dynamics of those dependencies.
Well, it is somewhat ironic in that if the last 2 years have taught Americans anything, I would think it would be that the need to be energy independent, mineral dependent, critical supply chain independent are important. And when you look at mineral processing in the United States, what you would find is that you can mine materials here if you can go through the process to get a permit. But once you do that, you would send them to China to be processed. And that is a reality. Many of the resources that are necessary for the development of these new vehicles and renewable technologies and great batteries, we do have in the United States, but we don't develop those materials because those have largely been outsourced in terms of the mineral development too. So when you look at these technologies, you have to ask yourself, if we truly wanted to go there as a country, we need to think through the supply chain and what we need to be supportive of to indeed do it. The other thing we have to realize is that the amount of land that some of these technologies require and the level of intensity that it takes is quite significant. At the Department of the Interior, when I was there, we approved a number of solar facilities. But it is unquestionable to me that solar is the most invasive activity we've ever permitted because it requires every square inch of the facility to not have any grass, essentially. And so it is a complete covering of the land. Each of these technologies, whether it's wind or solar, they come with impacts that have to be consciously thought of, and there is no such thing as a free lunch from an environmental perspective, and I think we have to remember that. There's obviously issues in terms of base load and a whole host of things that go into each of these technologies. And when you think about their benefits or their detriments, you need to think about the entire impact associated with them.
I was back home in Iowa this last weekend, and I saw a farmer post a picture of, he just converted his farmland, which got 200 bushels per acre the year before, into a solar farm. And so there is that land use question that we have to think through as well. And what are the opportunity costs and alternatives there. I think we have time for maybe a couple questions from the audience, and then I'll go back to Dave to close us out in a minute. Let's go here in the second row here.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso and you have all talked about oil and gas, but Senator Barrasso said Europe is now awake, wide awake, and President Biden is still sleepwalking. They're awake about coal as well, and no one has mentioned coal. Germany has decided to keep its coal plants running and to take plants out of mothballs. Coal prices are at an all-time high, but we've had a problem getting terminals on the East Coast and the West Coast to ship coal from our mines. And Wyoming has among the world's largest coal reserves, Wyoming and Montana, on federal land. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, Myron, I would say that that's certainly an oversight on my end that was inadvertent. When I think about fossil fuels, I think about everything, honestly. And I also think we should think more creatively about nuclear, to be honest with you. That said, the challenges, particularly for resources moving west, has been identical for coal versus the pipeline. So that you're spot on. And to be fair to Europe, we have some fundamentally different legal paradigms for property rights that I think have allowed the United States to flourish with shale in ways that are not necessarily identical in Europe. In many instances in the United States, the local landowners have benefited from the shale revolution. And so they have some different challenges with some of these things, but that is to our benefit. We have both this incredible natural bounty of resources, and we have a legal regime that, until a few years ago, was fostered on the development of those resources in responsible ways. And so the question I think Senator Barrasso was really making is, or the point he was making is, like, Europe is moving and we're stuck behind as a nation, caught in the fiction of a policy challenge that's not well thought out when you think of the strategic benefit of energy, the economic benefit of energy, and where we really need to be environmentally. And it's important to recognize that U.S. production, if you compare U.S. LNG to Russian LNG, U.S. LNG is much, much, much cleaner. And that is, to me, the biggest surprise to me of the Biden administration. I did not expect, I expected politicians to generally try and hit their policy target. And so I was not surprised when they said, hey, we're going to be hostile to resource development. They made a commitment to do that. They've hired people to do that. That's what they did. The biggest surprise to me was, hey, we're going to be hostile to American energy development, but we really want to encourage development in Venezuela and Russia, which are not only not cleaner, they're not economically beneficial in the United States, or from a national security perspective beneficial. That, to me, is shocking. It was a very surprising approach for them to take.
Thanks, Meyer, for the question being here. Let's go to the back of the room. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I just wanted to ask how we raise the profile of the fact that Putin has been involved in orchestrating the green movement. I've been looking into an organization called the Rosa Luxemburg foundation that was run by former East German communists and is loyal to Moscow, that trains all these green groups, and they're providing funding. I mean, I think.
And the reason they produce them is because it's expensive and hazardous to mine some of these minerals. The Chinese know this, the Russians know this. So if we do what these green movements are promoting, what the Russians are funding, we will be dependent on China, incredibly dependent, to make the batteries for these green vehicles. It will be much worse than the dependence we have right now, because we produce most of the oil we produce domestically. But producing the minerals for these batteries would require an enormous change in laws and people who don't want the environmental damage of drilling, of mining for these minerals. So, you know, we have to think really carefully, what type of dependency are we talking about if we move towards this green agenda?
I think we've got time for one more question. Before we go to the last question, I just want to introduce Sam Buchan, who is our director of the Center for Energy Independence. So feel free to continue this. Thanks, Sam, for your work on this. And feel free to continue the conversation with Sam and the panelists afterwards, as much time as they will allow. But I want to introduce Sam, and Beatrice Brooke is our policy analyst, has done some good work here as well. Let's go to Marty to close us out for the last question.
Frequently about the issue of uranium and domestic production of uranium, which of course is very important with nuclear energy. And nuclear energy is also something that there is some support on the other side. People like Carol Browner, who used to head up EPA and climate office at the Obama White House, she used to be against it, but now she's in favor of nuclear energy. So there is some support there that could have, I think, enormous benefits to us, and it has a much smaller footprint than wind and solar. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think the real challenge with nuclear is the permitting process is very, very challenging, and can people get through that process? And you know, and it's designed, in all fairness, to be very challenging. I mean, I worked at the Department of the Interior for 11 years, and I always thought the process of the NRC would be the last process I'd ever want to have at the Department of the Interior, because it's a very adversarial type of process just to get a permit.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to turn to David Bernhardt to close us out with some thoughts on the vision, America First, future-oriented vision for energy independence. How would you summarize that?
Well, I think you don't have to look very far back. You really only have to look back about 13 months to think, or 14 months, to think about the ability of a president to have a pro-energy, all of the above energy, pro-environmental stewardship vision and implement it. And the great thing about this area is, in many ways, if the administration moves the dial back to on and says we want to encourage this great economic opportunity for our country, it's doable. The biggest risk I see moving to the future is that this hostility does not mitigate itself, and we create a paradigm that people just simply don't want to engage in these activities because they know within a 2-year period or a 4-year period or an 8-year period, there's going to be such hostility that it doesn't make economic sense to be in these areas. And that's not good for our country. It's not good for our country. And that's what I see as one of the greatest risks here.
Great. Please help me in thanking Secretary Bernhardt and Fred Fleitz.